In the last video, I talked about why intelligence is the most important trait, as well as how to train for it, but I brushed over what intelligence is and how it works in football. In this video, I plan to explain both, as well as hopefully getting rid of some misconceptions. First off, to explain intelligence, we first have to stop referring to it as intelligence. Intelligence is too vague a term and has been rendered meaningless through overuse. A more accurate representation of what players do on the pitch is speed of thought. See, the difference between me and a professional isn't simply a matter of knowing what to do. Given enough time and space, I could figure out the best solutions to most situations. That's because in football, the amount of viable, and with an emphasis on viable, actions available to a player in any given situation is finite. There are 6, 7, at most 10 options. But what would take me 5, 10, maybe even 30 seconds to a full minute to fully puzzle out, trying to think through all the decision branches of those actions, elite players can do in a split second. But how can that be? Am I just that slow, or are professional players just gifted with more processing power? While the jury is still out on the former. As for the latter, humans across the board have a similar biological limitation on reaction speed and the amount of information we can absorb and compute at any one time. So, the difference in speed of thought between regular players and world-class ones isn't a matter of cognitive ability, it's a matter of perception. So, how exactly does this perception thing work, and how can I get better at it? In the 1940s, a Dutch psychologist by the name of Adrian de Groot performed a landmark study trying to figure out just that. De Groot, who was an avid chess amateur, grew increasingly frustrated with his inability to compete with people from his chess club. He wanted to understand his defeats, to identify the mental skill he was missing, how people just like him in age, experience, and background were nevertheless able to perform superhuman feats of chess mastery. You know, the sort of players that could destroy 10 people at once. Blindfolded. His initial hypothesis and the scientific wisdom at the time stated that it was all down to genetics. Master players, the theory went, were simply blessed with enhanced photographic memory which they used to absorb information, plan strategy, and exploit minor mistakes of their opponents, while the rest of us had to do with regular old average memory. De Groot's first experiment seemed to confirm this theory. He gathered a collection of chess players with varying levels of chess mastery, from complete novices to grandmasters. He then asked them to recreate a layout of 20 pieces on a chessboard from an actual game after a 5-second glance. The results were as what you might expect. The novices drew blanks, barely recreating 25% of the pieces, while the masters did it with 95% accuracy. The grandmasters, however, easily reproduced the layout of the game perfectly. The equation seems simple: memory equals talent. But then de Groot performed a second experiment that threw that theory wide open. Instead of using patterns from a real chess game, he scattered the 20 pieces randomly across the board in patterns you'd never see in a real game. If the theory that master players being blessed with enhanced photographic memories held, the location of the pieces shouldn't matter. They should be able to recall it just as well. But to de Groot's surprise, novices, masters, and everyone in between scored roughly about 25%. Everyone was on equal footing. The master players scored no better than the average players. In one case, a master player did even worse than a novice. The experiment ended up being pivotal in more than one way. It showed that the gap in talent wasn't about memory, it was about perception. Master players didn't have better memory, they simply saw the game better. In the first test, they weren't seeing 20 individual pieces, they were instead recognizing patterns. De Groot then went on to prove the mental process used, which we now know as chunking. Humans, generally speaking, can absorb only so much information at any one time. We have a working memory capacity of 4 units of information. It's the same for masters as it is for novices. But the way masters get away with it in chess, and us with general things in everyday life, is by a cognitive process called chunking. Chunking is an efficiency trick that the brain uses to break down large chunks of information into more manageable units. We have a limit of how many units of information we can process, 4. And we have a limit of how big those chunks can be. Also 4 units. For example, have you ever wondered why phone numbers are written the way they are? Writing the whole number out like this in one block would be far too large to process. And writing it out like this one number at a time would be smaller, yes, but it would be far too many units. This, however, fits both criteria perfectly and is the perfect sweet spot in between the two. Going back to the experiment, novices saw each piece as an individual piece, which constituted a whole unit of information. It was like trying to memorize the phone number one number at a time. Master players, however, saw a group of recognizable patterns, which they've probably seen and contemplated hundreds of times before. They recognize 6, 7, 8 because they've seen those numbers together in patterns hundreds of times. Same for 999 and 8212. So they weren't memorizing 10 different units of information, they were just memorizing 3. Simply put, the difference between us and them is, where in this number, most of us see it as just 3 different numbers with no relationships in between them. They see it as just 1, pi. The more chess you've played, the more likely it is you'll recognize bigger chunks. In the case of grandmasters, players who have reached the highest level in chess, they've played and studied so much chess, they've probably seen and studied the whole pattern on the board hundreds of times. So instead of seeing 3 different units, they'd memorize just 1, because they would recognize the whole number as 1 unit. For us, a pattern we'd recognize would be like these, for example. They're still 10 digits, but those numbers are easier to remember because those aren't simply numbers in our minds, they're chunks with meaning behind them. Or better yet, what about this one? Don't need to break that up into chunks, do you? Okay, cool. If you're like me, you're most likely wondering what the correlation between memory and chess mastery is. Sure, they memorize chess patterns, and so what? What does that have to do with the price of tea in China? They aren't good at chess because they've memorized a collection of different patterns. They're good at chess because they've memorized those patterns as well as the possible actions that come from those situations. So that means chess masters don't have to think through a decision tree of 15 possible moves in the future for each decision they make, and through that already know what the next best move is instinctively as a feeling. There's a saying, good chess players think 5-10 moves ahead. Great chess players think only 1, but it's always the right one. This is how chess players are able to play simul's. A simul is a chess tournament where one player plays against 20 to 30 people simultaneously, sometimes blindfolded. When asked what it was like to play in simul's, Josh Waitzkin, the chess prodigy who was the inspiration for the book and movie Searching for Bobby Fischer, explained, "It's not something you think, it's something you feel." Current chess world number 1 Magnus Carlsen also emphasizes the importance of intuition and gut feeling in his game as well. Footballers say much the same thing. They always say they rely on their instinct, and they run into trouble when they start to overthink on the pitch. Much more in football than in chess because, even though chess does have a time limit, it's nowhere near the almost instantaneous reactions and decision making required in football. It was actually something I looked down on for a long time. It wasn't sophisticated enough in my opinion, much like how an instinctual boxer is basically just a brawler. I believe wrongly that players like Ozil and Messi were thinking and calculating the game 4 or 5 moves ahead of everybody, because it didn't seem possible to me that anyone could make that good a decision consistently off instinct without considerable forethought. I was downright shocked when Mr. Cerebral Baller Mesut Ozil himself said the same thing. This is the same Ozil who, if you freeze a frame of him on the ball and analyze all his best options, you'd find 3, but he'll somehow come up with a 4th that will be better than all 3 he came up with after multiple minutes of analyzing. And he'll come up with it on the spot. You can refer to speed of thought as instinct or intuition, but much like intelligence, I feel they're too vague, come with their own connotations, and have also been rendered meaningless through overuse. The best way I've seen it explained is by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, where he explains that we have 2 operating systems, if you may, known as System 1 and System 2. System 1 is fast, instinctive, and emotional. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and logical. System 1 has many flaws and is extremely susceptible to biases. However, once trained, like with an expert in a certain field, it can be better than System 2. With doctors, for example, they're sometimes able to correctly diagnose what's wrong with someone intuitively just by the look on the patient's face or the way they walked into their office. But if pressed for an explanation of how they did it, they wouldn't be able to explain it to you. It's not psychic or telepathy, it's simply recognition of minute details that the conscious brain wouldn't pick up. Experts and professionals with sufficient experience in almost any field can do this to varying extent. Going back to the actual topic, which is football, to train intelligence, just play as many games as possible? Well, yes and no. Yes, get however many games you can, that's very important, but it's not the end all be all. For example, Ozil, who is funnily enough obsessed with chess, credits his intelligence to playing countless hours of small-sided cage football on a tiny concrete pitch with bigger and older players when he was growing up. Ozil was forced to constantly make decisions and problem solve before he even received the ball. With the size of the pitch and the proximity of the opposition, he would have had no time to think, and with the concrete floor, if he got caught on the ball and challenged by the bigger and older players, he would have fallen and gotten scraped up. So to do that, he would have had to have been constantly scanning, having a mental model of where everyone was, where the space was, where the ball was, and where the ball was going to be. So Ozil, through thousands of hours of playing, built up a database of thousands of different situations, as well as decisions that worked and decisions that didn't in those different situations without even thinking about it. He would also understand pattern sequences instinctively to a point where he can see a scenario coming up 3 or 4 passes into the future, which means he can go to that space, orient his body, and make the perfect through ball that splits 4 defenders with his first touch. This is what Cruyff meant in his quote from the first video. Speed is often confused with insight. If I start running earlier than someone, I seem faster. This is how an unathletic and immobile defensive midfielder like Busquets can look like he can predict the future when he goes to the right place at the right time to intercept the ball. This is why playing games is so important. However, you can play as many games as you want, and while you still learn a lot of technical ability, without a habit of scanning constantly to see what's around you, to build out your store database, it would have all been rendered basically useless. The habit of scanning is the most important thing. What you see and what you make of it will come with time. Like with chess, at first you'll see a scattered group of individual pieces, with a scattering of space in between. It'll be too much to fully comprehend, but slowly you'll start recognizing patterns and chunking those sequences of patterns with the decisions that worked and those that didn't from those situations into your database. Over time, the more of the game you see, the more of the game you'll comprehend, the bigger those chunks will be, to a point where you'll basically be able to read the game and react instinctively. Scanning is what I believe separates the intelligence level of players who grew up in the same environment under the same circumstances with the same experience and training. Outside of just playing pickup games, while a lot can still be learned from just playing them, only learning from street football can leave you with holes in your game. After all, games aren't exactly designed with development in mind. That's where a tactical periodization game model comes in. A good game model goes through all aspects of football such as technical, physical, and mental with an emphasis on intelligence, where each drill would simulate a game, artificially recreating different moments of the game, exposing player to as many different situations to learn from as possible. Some are better than others, but the most important thing is to be playing. There's a Spanish saying that I won't embarrass myself by butchering that translates to, players will learn, despite the coaches, as long as they get to play. Now tell me, how many different scenarios is this drill building? Exactly. Anyways, I think this video has gone on long enough. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video, but probably not for a while because this is bloody exhausting.